Did you know that Andrew Carnegie was the richest man in the world? Not just the richest man in America, but the entire globe. Why? Today, we're gonna dive into the secrets of one of the most influential billionaires of all time. This is the story of how Andrew Carnegie built and then broke up his steel empire. In the 1870s, America was changing rapidly. There was a mad rush to fill the nation's blank spots on the map, and fortune seekers packed up their belongings and headed west. Because of this migration, towns popped up in the desert and small communities quickly turned into bustling cities. Of course, this boom attracted the attention of businessmen who realized they could make a lot of money by providing services to these new communities. One of those people was Andrew Carnegie, but unlike many of his contemporaries, Carnegie was not interested in selling cheap trinkets or dangerous medicines. He wanted to build a real business based on quality products and a strong work ethic. That's why he decided to invest in steel. But don't get too excited just yet. This wasn't some hot-shot Silicon Valley startup. It was hard manual labor in Pennsylvania's steel factories. Although Carnegie was an executive, he spent most of his time working alongside factory laborers. You had to roll up your sleeves and get dirty if you wanted to succeed in the industry. However, despite the hardships, Carnegie continued working day after day until his business took off. In fact, he became so passionate about the steel industry that he started buying out railroads that transported the product to various parts of the country. As his influence grew, more and more entrepreneurs began taking notice of Carnegie and his accomplishments. But he still hadn't reached his full potential. It wasn't until he opened a steel plant in Homestead, Pennsylvania, that he became known as the Steel King of America. Carnegie had invented several machines to improve efficiency and increase production at his Homestead plant. For example, he developed a process called basic oxygen steelmaking, which made it easier to remove impurities from iron ore. This made his product stronger and cheaper at the same time. Soon enough, Carnegie Steel was producing over 2 million tons of steel a year, which was 1/3 of the entire country's supply. At his peak, the company was worth $400 billion today. And Carnegie was raking in around $25 million every week, which was the equivalent of $800,000 a day. That's why when he passed away in 1919, Forbes magazine declared him the richest man of the 19th century. With all this success, you'd think Carnegie would have become arrogant and complacent, right? But that was definitely not the case. In fact, according to history books, Carnegie was very humble and even a bit shy. Although he had worked his way up from being a poor Scottish immigrant to being a multi-billionaire, he never forgot where he came from, and he always tried to help people better their lives. For example, he built libraries, universities, and museums throughout the country. In fact, he donated over $350 million to charity during his lifetime, which adjusted to inflation was around $12 billion. That's why he earned the nickname, the ninth wonder of the world. But let's be honest here, he didn't do this because he felt bad for poor people. In fact, he once said that he liked to give away money because it enabled him to enjoy his wealth even more. The bottom line was that Andrew Carnegie knew exactly what it was like to be broke. So instead of simply writing off his donations as altruism, it's more accurate to say that he understood the value of helping others improve their financial situation. After all, he was one of them not too long ago. When Andrew was born in 1835, his family was dirt poor. They lived in a one-room tenement with a dirt floor and no furniture. His father, Thomas, was unemployed and couldn't provide for the family. So they had to rely on government assistance just to survive. To make matters worse, Andrew's older brother died at age 14 due to exhaustion and malnutrition. So it was up to him to carry on the family's legacy. However, as much as he wanted to help his family, Andrew was only 12 years old and couldn't find any high-paying jobs. That's why he ended up working as a bobbin boy in a textile factory. Even though this was a dangerous position that paid next to nothing, Andrew took it seriously and impressed his boss. In fact, his manager saw his natural leadership abilities and promoted him to be the youngest ever night watchman at age 18. As you can imagine, it wasn't glamorous. Andrew had to walk around the factory at night with a lantern, making sure no one stole anything or caused trouble. However, this was a pivotal moment in Andrew's life because it taught him the importance of hard work, discipline, and responsibility. These values would come in handy when he started his own businesses later on. But back then, Andrew was just doing his best to scrape by. He continued working in factories until one day he saved up enough money to buy a telegrapher's chair. At first, Andrew thought this was just a fun hobby, but soon enough he realized there was a huge demand for telegraph operators. So he got certified and started applying for jobs. Eventually, he got hired by the Pennsylvania Railroad as an operator, which paid him $1.20 a week. This was life-changing money. Now Andrew was able to buy food for his family and pay rent for a decent apartment. But despite the fact that he had finally achieved financial stability, Andrew knew that this wasn't good enough. If he really wanted to make a difference in the world, he had to take risks, push boundaries, and break the mold. That's why he left his job at the railroad and invested all his savings into the steel industry. Now we know how that turned out. Andrew built up a successful career as an executive and eventually founded Carnegie Steel Company in 1872, but not everyone shared his passion for hard work and innovation. Some people were happy with the status quo and didn't want to change a thing. And, of course, they weren't going to help Carnegie accomplish his dreams. That's why he had to play a dangerous game of business poker to expand his empire. For example, in 1876, Carnegie bought out several railroads that were transporting his steel products across the country. This gave him an unfair advantage over his competitors because now he could control the transportation system and set his own prices. Of course, other businessmen weren't happy about this, but they couldn't do anything about it. After all, Carnegie had followed the rules and bought up the railroads legally. However, things took a dark turn when Carnegie decided to take on Henry Frick, who was one of his partners in the business. On July 6, 1892, Frick tried to get rid of Carnegie by turning off the power to Carnegie's house and surrounding it with armed men. But Carnegie ended up finding out about the plan ahead of time and escaped without a scratch. This is when Carnegie Steel Company became a monopoly. See, when Frick's men went to arrest Carnegie, they found out that he had already sold his company to J.P. Morgan for $400 million. With this money, Carnegie retired and started spending his time on philanthropy. But that doesn't mean he abandoned his steel empire. In fact, he was very happy with the deal he made with J.P. Morgan. After all, it enabled him to spread his wealth around and make a positive impact on society. Plus, he didn't have to worry about running a business anymore. All he had to do was enjoy his life and watch his empire grow. Well, that was the plan anyway. The United States government ended up breaking up Carnegie Steel Company in 1911 due to antitrust laws. This meant that Andrew lost control of his empire, but it also gave him more freedom to pursue his personal projects. For example, he wrote several books about his experiences in the steel industry and donated them to public libraries. He also traveled around the world meeting with other influential leaders and giving speeches about the importance of hard work and innovation. Even though Andrew Carnegie was no longer in charge of a massive steel empire, he was still a major player in the business world. He continued investing in railroads, factories, and mines, and he used his wealth to help promote peace between nations. In fact, he became so influential that many people considered him to be the father of modern capitalism. But no matter how much money you have, there will always be someone who wants more. Unfortunately, Andrew Carnegie learned this lesson the hard way when his empire was broken up. He spent years trying to rebuild his business and regain his status as the richest man in the world, but it just wasn't meant to be. That's why he started focusing on his next project, which was becoming the world's greatest philanthropist. In reality, Carnegie wasn't motivated by altruism. He just wanted to feel important again. But that doesn't mean his donations weren't appreciated. In fact, millions of people benefited from Carnegie's generosity during his lifetime and in the years since then. For example, he built over 1,600 libraries, funded hundreds of universities, and donated millions of dollars to charities that helped the less fortunate. Even though Carnegie was a shrewd businessman, he didn't let that get in the way of his philanthropic efforts. In fact, he often said that it was more important to give away money than to keep it. And if that's not a lesson in humility, then I don't know what is. Would you rather die rich or give your money away while you're still alive? Let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. And if you enjoyed the video, please make sure to subscribe. We've got lots of exciting content coming up. See you next time.